Good afternoon, colleagues. If everybody can please take their seat, the UNHCR press briefing is about to start. Good afternoon again. My name is Joël Aïd. I work for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. Whether you're joining us here in person at COP29 or online, welcome to our global launch of UNHCR's first standalone report, which explores the interlinkages between climate change, conflict, and forced displacement. No Escape is a joint data and analysis report led by UNHCR in partnership with over a dozen research partners, academics, and refugee-led organizations like the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, CGIAR, the Green Climate Fund, Impact, and many others. Joining me today to present its findings is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, alongside refugee climate activist Grace de Rong, also the founder and executive director of Root of Generations, as well as my colleague, Jana Berner, UNHCR's climate data expert and coordinator of the report we're launching here today. We will begin with a statement by Grace, followed by the High Commissioner, who will share key findings from the report alongside UNHCR's position at COP29. We will then open the floor for questions. A few words about Grace de Rong. Grace is a climate activist and founder of Root of Generations. Grace is a former refugee from South Sudan who grew up in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya and has experienced displacement due to conflict and climate-related hazards. She is now based in Juba and works to advocate for climate action with and for affected communities in South Sudan and beyond. Grace, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Grace de Rong, a mother and activist from South Sudan. I was baptized after being displaced, separated from my parents, from my surroundings, and from my ancestors due to war in my country. During my displacement, however, I faced a lot of other dangers. I was met with droughts. I was met with extreme heat before I finally reached Kakuma refugee camp. I thought it would offer me a home, but everything was temporary, except the education I ended up receiving. That was for life, and that's why I'm here today. After years of multiple displacements, dry, cracked lips and toes, I had to make a choice. Give up or to keep the hope. I returned home and founded Root of Generations, which empowers displaced youth and women to design their own solutions and create their own paths. No matter how hard we try to build the lives we want for ourselves, the fight gets harder with each passing day because of climate change. My country, South Sudan, faces multiple hazards such as drought, flooding, and conflict. Since the conflict erupted in Sudan, there has been an influx of refugees who have fled war to find safety in my country, but are having to face the same challenges we are. I often describe it as moving from a frying pan into the fire. Refugees have no escape. You flee in one direction, you are met with one danger. You flee in another direction, you are met with another danger. The climate crisis drastically impacting our lives. If it hasn't yet, it will soon also impact yours. All of us, but we have a choice to make. Put it off as it burns fiercely towards us, or watch it come to us. People with lived experience should not just tell the story, but they should write the story and design solutions. I know how it can be solved. I'm just overwhelmed because I'm unable to do it alone. Frontline communities, especially in fragile and conflict areas, need your assistance. I'm here to say we don't want to stop with the story of how it happened. We need to tell the story of how it was solved. This report brings to you the evidence and voices of millions of people, especially women and children. Women who are giving birth in the bushes, in the waters, staying overnight because they have no dry place to sleep in. An infant child whose umbilical cord is being cut with a broken stone. That child in me who was drowned in the despair of separation, who doesn't know the real birth date, nor her original name. All we know now is action. All we need now is action. Really action, meaningful action from all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change knows no borders. Its effects do not discriminate. Yet some bear the burdens far more heavily than others. Our displaced populations are among the most vulnerable, but with the right investments, partnership, and commitments, we turn vulnerability into resilience, transforming these communities into beacons of strength and sustainability. Let us rise to this challenge, honoring our shared humanity and commitment to leaving no one behind. Together we can build a world where even the most vulnerable have the infrastructure they need, not just to survive, but to thrive. Please don't look away. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very powerful words, Grace. We will now hear from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. High Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Now, it's very, very difficult to say anything meaningful after listening to Grace. So forgive me if I have to add a few points, but I feel it is very important because, of course, what Grace said, what she shared with us, her experience, speaks to the broader issue of refugees, of forced displacement. What we want to highlight today with this report that we are launching, that UNHCR is launching, is that we hear this message throughout the COP today, in these days, that climate change impacts everybody. But of course, depending on who you are, where you find yourself, it impacts you more or less. But in this case, certainly more. And the key statistic, the key figure of this report, in my opinion, is that out of a total population of people, what we call forcibly displaced, refugees, internally displaced people, asylum seekers, out of all this large number of people on the move, 120 million plus, this is our current statistic, 90 million, 3 out of 4, live in countries or in areas that are extremely fragile from the climatic point of view. So you see clearly the intersection that Grace explained very much from her personal experience between displacement, and climate change and the climate crisis. And this is, of course, a growing trend, not a trend that goes towards reduction. The study also, I will not illustrate, it's quite good and fairly easy reading, so I really encourage you to read it. But one other point that for me is very important in this study is that it shows that this relationship between the climate emergency and the displacement of people is not a simple one. You know, so many times in the common discourse, we hear a simple equation. Climate change displaces people, sometimes with figures as well. Now, it's much more complex than that, and I think the report shows very clearly this complexity. For example, half of those 120 million people live in a situation which are both characterized by climate change and by conflict. So this is the third side of this triangle. You have displacement, you have climate change, and you have conflict. And the relationship between each one of these three, the relationships are multiple and very complex. And it is important to understand this complexity, to understand that it is not a simple situation in order to better design and implement the responses to this different type of crisis. Of course, I think Grace explained very well also another important characteristic, that climate change is a multiplier of the plight, of the hardship of those displaced. And that sometimes people, because 90 out of 120, 3 out of 4 live in climate fragile areas, or rather find themselves displaced in climate fragile areas, are compelled, are obliged to move again. The first time, maybe, for example, by conflict, the second time because there is a drought. I give you just an example. That's why it's called no escape, because it's like a continuous pressure on people to move. What the report suggests, what we suggest at UNHCR, is really 4 key messages, 4 key directions. And one is the most obvious: accelerate the reduction of the carbon footprint, because that will have, hopefully, a positive effect in the direction of climate change in general, but in particular for people that are most vulnerable. Second, we use the word protect in UNHCR. So people that are impacted by this combination of factors require special forms of protection. Some forms of protection are legal in nature. There are many instruments, refugee legal instruments, instruments related to the protection of internally displaced people and more, that can be utilized to ensure the protection of those on the move for these reasons. But protection is, of course, protection also in the context of many other vulnerabilities that need to be taken into account. Third point is, of course, invest. And this is very, very crucial, because as we all know, but the report highlights it very clearly, a vast majority of the resources that are invested under the rubric of climate action, of climate responses, are invested in high-emitting countries, not in the countries where these most vulnerable people find themselves. So we need to make sure that this, which is yet another aspect of climate injustice, is corrected, and that more resources go also to where the impact of climate change is most acute. And finally, include. And here we have the example. We believe very strongly, and increasingly so in UNHCR, that it is important to include the voice of those displaced, the voice of those most impacted in the discussion around responses to the climate emergency. And when I say responses, I mean at all levels: planning, advocacy, implementation, discussions. And that's why it has been so important to listen to Grace. I'll conclude by saying I hope that one message is clear. UNHCR, I speak now for our organization, is a humanitarian organization, is a refugee organization, is a protection organization, we are not climate experts, but we see on the ground, in contact with people like Grace, the human impact, the ultimate human impact on the most vulnerable people of what is being discussed here at COP29. So it is important to remember that for people that are impacted like Grace has been, this is not a theoretical argument. This is not a political discussion. This is an everyday reality that impacts dramatically their lives.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We will take questions now. We have colleagues passing microphones. If you can please raise your hand and introduce yourself before asking the question. We'll try to take as many questions as possible. Thank you. The gentleman over here, please.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Usman Mohammed, and I'm from Somalia. I'm working with the Ministry of Public Works, Reconstruction and Housing as a special project advisor through a project funded by World Bank on the Somalia Urban Resilience Project on urbanization. So the question I would like to ask is, I have a refugee background. I am from the Dadaab refugee camp, where we first settled in the year 1991 when I was 6 months old. I left the Dadaab refugee camp to Somalia in the year 2015 when I was 24 years old. By the time I finished my high school, getting back home, I started working with federal member states. So the question that I'm going to ask the Commissioner and also the fellow UNHCR colleagues, that back the Dadaab refugee camp where I came from, it still serves as a hub for refugee and still is a refugee camp. Yet that 33 years that the camp existed doesn't have any infrastructure that have really very sufficiently provided to the refugees living in a refugee camp. Sometimes I still get calls from my colleagues, from my relatives that run out of schools, sometimes fundings or school packages or school books that I sometimes turn on my own pocket to buy them. When it comes to infrastructure, I've seen the other day a video where people in the outskirts of the Dadaab refugee camp, IFO2 and IFO3, in which the Commissioner may be familiar with, are still facing lack of access to water, and they were using contaminated water in a very small dam that they received rainwater. So, dear Commissioner, when are those camps are going to be turned into a more urbanized villages or cities that have access to basic infrastructures? Because I still feel the same feelings that I have in the year 1991 to 2000, because the same poor infrastructure still exists. The same notions of feelings that I had 20 years ago still exist, even more worse, due to climate change and other impacts, and also a shrink source of constraints, and also when it comes to finance. Initially in the year 1991 till to 2000 or 2010, there was interest in funding those projects around the refugee camps. But now, due to the exhaustion by the donors, and also it seems like they are somehow left, and so the situation still wasn't. So the question is, dear Commissioner, how are those refugee camps going to be more sustainable? That's the question I would like to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is an important question. I assume, I couldn't hear properly everything, but you talked about the Dadaab. You talked about refugee camp in Kenya, right? Yeah. I think you are giving a perfect example for on a very important issue. It is very clear that the traditional model of refugee response, which prevailed, until some time ago, which is refugees arrive, you organize a camp, you provide all the services, and you continue to care for the refugees until supposedly they can go back to their country or they find another solution. That model is not sustainable. I fully agree with you. And Dadaab somehow has become the symbol of how that is not sustainable for all the reasons that you have mentioned. That the refugees came in the 90s, in the early 90s, in fact, I think 1991, if I'm not mistaken, and now 30 years plus later, there are no more resources, no more interest, and as a matter of fact, a lot of other problems that have grown around the camp, of misery inside, of instability outside. And I have to tell you that the good news about that situation is that of late, in the last year or year and a half, the government of Kenya has agreed that continuing with that approach, which they favored initially, is not sustainable anymore, and that, as I quote to you what President Ruto told me when he communicated this decision, we want refugees in Kenya to become part of our communities. Now, this is not full integration, if you wish, but it is a much more sustainable model whereby the support that is provided, including by the international community, is not just only for the refugees in a camp, but for the community as a whole. It's not anymore a humanitarian response, but a development response, of which both the host community and the refugees will benefit. This will require considerable investment in the education system of that region, in the health system. And by the way, because Garissa County in Kenya is one of the most climate impacted areas of the country, it will require also climate related intervention. So it relates to what we have said, but in a way that in this case, if it is properly done and properly financed, can lead to sustainable solutions.
We have 3 more minutes. The lady here in the back. And then, yeah.
Hello, my name is Madison Harris. I'm a student from Indiana University, and I wanted to ask about, you mentioned internally displaced persons, and I was curious, there are, of course, legal instruments available for internally displaced persons for climate-induced displacement, but what needs to be done to provide these protections for externally displaced people? Because there are climate-induced displacement for people who are crossing borders, international borders, and they lack those rights and those protections. So what needs to be done? Is it an international agreement of some sort? Does it need to be regional? What would you say needs to be done?
I think when you say externally displaced, you mean refugees or people that cross borders. I would say that in most cases, it's a complex legal issue, but in most cases, people that cross borders for reasons that include climatic reasons can avail themselves of a variety of legal instruments that cover almost all situations. In some cases, the Refugee Convention. In other cases, regional conventions. You have the OAU Convention in Africa that is broader than the Refugee Convention. You have the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America that is considerably broader, and so on and so forth. And of course, what UNHCR is telling governments is because this can be fairly complex situation from the legal point of view, we are available to help develop ad hoc policies for specific groups in order to guarantee their protection. And you know what? Governments actually are asking us for assistance and support in these particular cases. But like I said, in most cases of cross-border displacement, the existing instruments, don't think only of the convention, think of more broadly, in addition to national legislation, of course, are quite adequate to cover the protection needs, I would call them like this, of a population on the move.
Apologies, we'll take one final question from Jayanta from The Telegraph, and then we can continue outside if you have any additional questions.
Jayanta Basu from Telegraph India. Thanks for a wonderful report. A very quick question. Do you think that the acknowledgement and admittance of the climate change forced migrants as legitimate refugees is the proper legal refugees? They are not, climate migrants are not having the refugee status per se. So that is the legally admitted refugee status, the first step in the right direction of addressing the problem?
Please, remember what I said earlier. There is a simplistic view that there is a, climate change is there somewhere and it forces people to flee, and these people are climate refugees. Climate is a factor. Climate change is a factor contributing to the movement of people, and very often, in Africa in particular, but not only, connected with conflict, very often connected with other factors. So you have to look at the situations one by one. And like I answered the previous question, in most cases, you don't need to create new instruments. The existing instruments cover that from the legal point of view. I forgot to add a point, but I'm using your question now to mention it. Remember that in 2018, the United Nations adopted, endorsed, the right word is affirmed, 2 compacts, one on refugees and one on safe and orderly migration. Now, the compacts are not treaties like the Refugee Convention, but they are very important toolboxes adopted by the UN General Assembly, so they have a quite considerable legitimacy, and they are toolboxes of tools that we're proposing to governments to utilize in the responses to displacement. And climate change as a factor of displacement is clearly included in both compacts, on safe and orderly migration and on refugees. So, there are legal tools, there are practical tools that are increasingly resorted to by governments. And I think that, you see, to reopen, for example, many people are asking me, why don't we reopen the 1951 Refugee Convention to include an element of climate as a factor? I would say, first of all, the Refugee Convention is broad enough that you can interpret it as covering also these situations. And second, let's not reopen conventions in the present political climate. You will get a reduction, not an expansion of their interpretation.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Thank you, everyone. I'm afraid our time is up.
Only if the question is for Grace.
Is the question for Grace? Okay, we'll hear.
Thank you so much. My name is Valentina Ospina. I am an academic and researcher from the Geneva School of Diplomacy. And my question is, of course, for Grace and the UNHCR, and is, my parents were displaced, internally displaced in Colombia, and your experience is incredible inspiration for other people who have also been displaced. And I know that the report that you're launching is based mostly in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa. And do you feel that there's a need to also involve refugees and do conduct this a study in other parts in the world, such as Central and Latin America, which incredibly suffer high levels issues of protection and conflict, and especially in countries such as Colombia and Venezuela, that they have a very big issue in these terms? Thank you.
No, I can't.
I think we're being called to leave the room because there's a press briefing. I'm really sorry.
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. But Grace will be outside. You can ask her questions yourselves. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our speakers. And please do check out the No Escape on the Front Lines of Climate Change, Conflict and Displacement on the UNHCR website. Thanks, everyone. He's my boss.
I know.
He gave the green light for the last one.
Can you take?